At its best and biggest, Spirit Airlines was the worst. The same year, it was hailed as one of the fastest growing US domestic carriers after introducing 7 new A320s to its fleet, adding 17.9% more available seat miles, and opening over 20 new nonstop routes. Spirit also made news for how frequently people complained about it. Here's the frequency with which other carriers received complaints over cancellations, delays, and other flight issues over a 4-year period, and here's the frequency of complaints at Spirit, tripling most and trending upward. A decade later, little had changed. The airline had risen to the 7th largest North American carrier by total passengers, while also coming in second to last in J.D. Power's customer satisfaction ratings. But just a few years after that, with the arrival of flight NK-1833 at Dallas-Fort Worth in the early hours of May 2nd, 2026, the carrier was now gone entirely. And rather than celebrate the end of an airline that nickel and dimed you on everything, that delayed and ran late often, that offered a generally unpleasant flying experience, its end was met with a sort of melancholy nostalgia. Effectively a final proof that while the product wasn't pretty, it was effective in filling a previously unserved corner of the market. And though easy to conflate the carrier's collapse with its ultra-cheap approach, the reality is that Spirit found a niche with its ultra-low-cost model that the rest hadn't quite recognized but would eventually race to catch up to. With the fleet maxing out at over 200 planes and nearly 20,000 employees, Spirit momentarily mastered its niche, the ultra-low-cost, entirely unbundled domestic leisure market, but this took decades to refine. From the start, Spirit wasn't for the business traveler, it wasn't for the wealthy, it was for budget-conscious leisure travelers. Born out of a trucking company that had begun to dip its toes into air shipping, Spirit began in 1983 as Charter One. Rather than actually operating its own flights, the company was more so a tour operator, coordinating gambling itineraries first from Detroit, Boston, and Providence to Atlantic City, then eventually the Bahamas and Las Vegas. A decade in, these leisure services had proved popular enough to justify expansion of both the fleet and the routings. Filing with the Department of Transportation in 1992 to run scheduled passenger services, a new budget-friendly leisure carrier was born. Rather than keeping its Convair 580 turboprops going, the carrier acquired 13 DC-9s and renamed itself Spirit Airlines. From just 3 routes in 1992, the service quickly expanded. By 1996, the network looked like this, still based out of Detroit and running a lot of popular domestic, budget-friendly leisure routes from the Northeast and Midwest, now to Florida and Myrtle Beach alongside Atlantic City. As the airline grew through the decade, this north-south vacation destination orientation largely remained, along with an addition of a Detroit to LA route in 1999 and the company's first true international route with a service from Fort Lauderdale to Cancun, Mexico. Through the 90s, Spirit established itself as a bona fide low-cost carrier. The planes, first DC-9s, then briefly larger MD-80s towards the end of the decade, were neither new nor especially amenity-laden. The service, punctuated by a 1994 mistake that saw the company unintentionally overbook 1,400 tickets, was going to be hit or miss sometimes. But ultimately, the tickets were going to be comparatively cheap, and you'd still get a drink, a snack, a checked bag, and your choice of seat. It was budget, but budget in the same way that Southwest was budget. This wasn't working. In 1999, Spirit sued Northwest Airlines in what would become an instructive moment for the company. They alleged that Northwest, a legacy airline, had slashed their prices out of Detroit and flooded the market with tickets in an effort to push Spirit out. Spirit would eventually settle with Northwest, but Northwest argued that it maintained profitability along those routes throughout the period. Ultimately, the strategy would help push Spirit to relocate its headquarters to Fort Lauderdale, but it pointed at an issue that was increasingly beginning to cost the company at the turn of the century. It just wasn't quite cheap enough to compete with legacy carriers' cheapest options. In the early 2000s, the company was now losing money. It was floundering, and it needed a shot in the arm. The transformation from cheap to cheapest started with the 2005 appointment of Ben Baldanza as president, who had lamented the lack of a true European-style ultra-low-cost carrier in the US. Baldanza gained an all-important ally when private equity firm Indigo Partner bought a controlling stake in Spirit a year later. Having global experience with and interest in ultra-low-cost carriers, the new controlling owner, along with the company's new leader, went all in on ultra-cheap. They called this strategy unbundling, the idea that the listed price of a flight would guarantee nothing more than a spot somewhere on the plane. A concept simple enough, but one that would have to be introduced incrementally. First, in 2007, that meant a $10 fee for a second checked bag, then no complimentary food or drinks, then no free seat selection. You'd have to pay for that. The following year, there was now a fee for a first checked bag, then even a fee to print a boarding pass. Next, in 2010, the company announced an industry first, a $45 fee for overhead storage of carry-on items. Even Ryanair hadn't tried such a fee yet, and the policy created such an uproar that US senators introduced a bill to stop it. The airline was now well on its way to the worst, but it was offering fares so outrageously low that while it was easy to complain about the product, for the cash-strapped college kid looking to get south for spring break, you just couldn't argue with the prices. At the same time Spirit normalized unbundled airfare to the American traveler, it was overhauling its fleet to exclusively use Airbus A320s as it streamlined maintenance and maximized seats per plane. In 2011, having found its niche and gone all in, Spirit went public. That same year, it garnered more than 30% of its total revenue from fees. While the morals of it all may have felt questionable, the results were undeniable as total passengers ballooned from under 7 million in 2010 to almost 34 million in 2019, while the company turned a profit each of those years. The company was unapologetic but upfront about its pricing model, its ads were aggressively targeted to young budget travelers, and its network was expanding. At the end of the decade, the company reached its peak. It offered about the worst flying experience possible, but it was flying more passengers and making more money than ever through a business model still rather unique in the American airline scene. As with every airline in every country, COVID was catastrophic for Spirit, a near complete loss of revenue. But where their fortunes truly shifted relative to the rest was in the recovery years. While other US airlines marched back towards profitability, Spirit just didn't. For some reason, an industry-leading business model pre-COVID just couldn't come back to life after, but what the calamity of COVID masked was the continued progression of trends that were already starting to put pressure on the airline in the years before. A strange thing had been happening. Americans were increasingly choosing to spend more to fly. It's not that people wanted to pay more for the same product, but rather, on average, passengers were more frequently electing to pay for more premium offerings. As the major US airlines started to post profits again post-COVID, they kept remarking in their earnings releases that their economy cabins were flat to down, whereas premium economy and business class were driving their revenue growth. Airlines responded to this by building more business class. United unveiled a new 787 configuration with just 20% of space allocated towards standard economy, while JetBlue and Frontier elected to roll out business class cabins fleet-wide for the first time. Explanations abound for this phenomena, but the simplest and surest is that Gen Z and millennials are representing a larger and larger portion of spending power in America, and these younger generations have always spent disproportionately on experiences versus physical goods. That includes travel, which these generations allocate a greater portion of their income to than others, and with more money devoted towards travel, that's more people who elect to treat themselves to extra legroom, premium economy, or business class. It used to be that premium seats, and especially domestic premium seats, were primarily purchased by business travelers with expense accounts, and so budget airlines, which are inherently leisure-oriented, didn't have to worry about premium offerings. Once this premiumization trend emerged, Spirit's primarily economy fleet had no way of capturing the revenue upside, while it also suffered a downside as some of the trend manifested through travelers electing to pay more for a full-service airline rather than Spirit's bare-bones offering. The low-cost market was eroding. But on top of that, Spirit's ability to capture that tranche of the market was eroding too. Throughout the late 2010s, Delta, American, and United each progressively rolled out a new fare class that they called Basic Economy. Essentially, they just offered the same as Spirit. Rock-bottom prices, but with no bag, no seat selection, no refunds, nothing included. The major airlines' pricing algorithms would often match or nearly match Spirit's fares in a market, but the big airline brand names would win customers over thanks to a perception of better service and reliability. In the pre-COVID years, this did not represent an existential threat to Spirit, just a new dimension of competition, but it did appear to chip away at its profits. What was a mid-20s operating margin in 2015 fell to low 10s by the time the first coronavirus cases emerged in Wuhan. Just as with the premiumization trend, this momentum appeared to continue through COVID, and by 2024, United, for example, reported that basic economy now represented 16% of its domestic passenger base. But while this represented a slow erosion of Spirit's financial moat, the airline ran into far more acute issues as well. Back in 2016, Spirit became the first US airline to acquire the brand new A320neo. The aircraft's innovative Pratt & Whitney PW1100G geared turbofan engines burn about 16% less fuel than the previous generation, and considering how much Spirit used each one of its aircraft, this led to some real cost savings during its lucrative late 2010s years. But the engines had issues. Come summer 2023, Pratt & Whitney issued a recall notice. They discovered that for 6 years, their factory in New York had been using contaminated powdered metal to create the blades for the engine's core. The contamination was subtle enough that the engines passed inspections and typically flew perfectly fine, but while operating, microscopic cracks were forming far sooner than expected. This is only known to have ever caused one actual aircraft incident, and even that only resulted in an aborted takeoff, but if left unaddressed, as engines got older, more failures would inevitably follow. So regulators called for inspections of about 1,200 potentially affected PW1100Gs, and these inspections were far from trivial. Operators had to park their aircraft, physically remove engines, then ship them to one of only about 20 shops worldwide qualified to undertake the process. These shops would then disassemble the engines, inspect each and every blade using ultrasonic devices, then replace affected blades. All in, this process took upwards of 250 days, and there was the dual constraint of shop capacity and replacement blade supply, meaning aircraft groundings went on for years. At its peak, Spirit had to park 40 of their A320neo family aircraft and still pay for their lease costs. With constraint on their aircraft supply, the airline completely pulled out of Boston and Cleveland and heavily cut back on Dallas flying, leaving less opportunity for them to dig themselves out of their financial hole. While they did get some compensation from Pratt & Whitney, it was far from enough to make up for the financial loss. Spirit wasn't alone in its financial struggles post-COVID. The same pressures eating its profits were present across all American low-cost airlines. As cash reserves dwindled, they all scrambled for solutions, and some chose to turn to the most tried and tested solve for airline financial woes: consolidation. On February 7, 2022, Spirit announced its intention to merge with Frontier. The two airlines operated near-identical business models, bare-bones fares on leisure-oriented routes, and even flew the same aircraft types, making fleet integration simple. But they were also different in the ways that mattered. Frontier's network was oriented more towards the West, while Spirit focused on the East, Caribbean, and South America. Only 18% of the pair's routes overlapped, meaning combined they could become a truly nationwide, mega ultra-low-cost carrier representing the 5th largest airline in America. All that was left to make the merger plan official was for shareholders to vote on the matter, but considering this was a board-approved deal, precedent suggested that this was all but a formality. Precedent, however, was wrong. JetBlue had a different plan. They submitted an offer to buy Spirit for $33 a share, far above the $25 or so per share the Frontier deal implied. On paper, this was a far more valuable bid. Regardless, Spirit's board responded with this: "Our board has unanimously determined that JetBlue's proposal does not constitute a, quote, superior proposal under Spirit's existing merger agreement with Frontier. We believe a combination of JetBlue and Spirit has a lower probability of receiving antitrust clearance." In short, Spirit's board believed that even if they and their shareholders agreed to the merger proposal, the merger was unlikely to happen, as the Department of Justice would sue to block it under the provisions of antitrust law, arguing that it was harmful for consumers. Spirit had good reason to believe this. The Biden DOJ had earned a reputation as perhaps the most aggressively anti-consolidation administration of the 21st century. And in fact, JetBlue had already been targeted by this DOJ with a lawsuit to stop its Northeast Alliance joint venture with American Airlines. Spirit's perspective was that the Biden administration would consider the potential consumer harm of a tie-up with Frontier quite differently than one with JetBlue. JetBlue, after all, is not an ultra-low-cost carrier. It definitionally fulfills some of the criteria of a low-cost carrier, but operates more of a hybrid model with extra legroom, free Wi-Fi, business class offerings, and even long-haul routes to Europe. Their plan, if they were to acquire Spirit, was to fold the ultra-low-cost carrier into the JetBlue brand and operate it the way JetBlue operated, meaning the US airline market would lose the price competition that Spirit in its current form provided. In the Frontier merger scenario, meanwhile, two ailing ultra-low-cost carriers would consolidate into a larger, stronger competitor, potentially elevating their competitive influence on the broader market to a point greater than the sum of their parts. Shareholders, however, did not share the concern. Spirit lacked the votes to approve the merger, and so they kept delaying and delaying and delaying the vote. For months, a cycle emerged of another delay, another tweak of terms by Frontier and JetBlue, and another delay until the writing was on the wall. Shareholders wanted the JetBlue offer. It was just too tantalizing. And so the board approved the JetBlue merger, shareholders soon followed, and the two airlines started the lengthy process of preparing to close the transaction. But then, as foretold, the Department of Justice sued to stop the merger on antitrust grounds. In fact, in their original complaint, the DOJ cited what Spirit itself said the DOJ would say, that this was a, quote, high-cost, high-fare airline buying a low-cost, low-fare airline, and that, quote, a JetBlue acquisition will have lasting negative impacts on consumers. The facts were hard to argue with. Quote, JetBlue estimates that when Spirit stops flying a route, average fares go up by 30%. At trial, the airlines argued that even if low-cost capacity would be eliminated, the creation of a more meaningful non-budget competitor to Delta, United, and American would be pro-consumer, and they offered divestiture of key assets like slots and gates to offset any remaining consumer harm. Ultimately, though, the odds were never good. From the perspective of antitrust law, it was about as slam dunk of a case as ever makes it to trial. There was clear, objective reduction of competition, so from the point at which the DOJ decided to pursue it, it appeared far likelier than not that they were going to win, and so they did. Spirit was right back to where it started, yet with hundreds of millions of dollars of cash and 2 years wasted. In the aftermath, Spirit floundered through various half-hearted solutions to dig itself out of its hole. It attempted to shrink to profitability by cutting its fleet back to less than 100 aircraft, almost entirely pulling out of the West, and instead refocusing on shorter distance, East Coast, North-South flying to vacation destinations. In 2023, they were burning about $1.2 million in cash a day to keep afloat. In 2024, this ramped up to $3.4 million, and by 2025, it spiraled yet further to $7.5 million in financial loss per day. The airline went through multiple rounds of Chapter 11 bankruptcy, it rejected another, far weaker merger offer by Frontier, and for most of 2025, it perpetually sat on the precipice of collapse, yet each time it looked imminent, Spirit found another lifeline to fund another few months of operations. But then the slow bleed was stopped by a beheading. The Trump administration attacked Iran retaliated by closing the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices spiked massively, and the airline's single largest cost outright doubled. The end was now inevitable. The business had failed. Spirit had sunk, and the best option for investors was to accept reality and recover what assets they could. In the early hours of May 2nd, 2026, Spirit sent out its last press release. 17,000 individuals lost their jobs, and a 34-year legacy of safe transport of almost 500 million passengers came to an abrupt and unceremonious end as the last yellow Airbus touched down at DFW. When this end became inevitable is a much debated question. There are plenty of differing opinions on which decisions could have altered this outcome. In the reality where Spirit did successfully merge with Frontier, there's every world in which that would have sunk both airlines. While Frontier's post-COVID years were comparatively better, they've still yet to regain long-term profitability. Similar to Spirit, they've been cycling through various business model tweaks, but there's not much in their financial results to yet suggest that they've found their footing. While there's an argument to be made that the consolidated, larger airline emerging from a merged Spirit and Frontier could have competed its way to profitability, the fact that almost every American low-cost carrier, even beyond the two, is still losing money makes that incredulous. Perhaps the more convincing argument is that the Biden DOJ should have allowed the JetBlue merger, even if the antitrust case against it was strong. Informed observers could understand all the way back in 2023 that Spirit was possibly on a path towards bankruptcy. From the DOJ's perspective, the counterfactual was Spirit remains Spirit, when in reality, it was that Spirit collapses. In retrospect, it becomes fairly uncontroversial to say that the better outcome would have been for Spirit to consolidate into JetBlue, saving thousands of jobs and creating stronger competition against the majors. Effectively, the Biden DOJ took a risk, and the risk failed. In any world, though, Spirit could not truly remain Spirit. The Spirit that people love to hate The rock-bottom fare, buzzball peddling, bright yellow airline for the masses wasn't killed off by the Biden DOJ or the Trump-induced oil spike or any single action by anyone because there was no world in which the form the airline took at its peak could continue into 2027 and beyond. The American airline industry had changed, and so Spirit's ultra-low-cost model was as good as dead, regardless of what mergers or metamorphosis happened next. In spite of Spirit's reputation among passengers, it was undoubtedly good for them. In a vast country with little public transit, the airline enabled movement for more by asking for less. It brought people to family and friends, births and deaths, weddings and funerals when it might not have otherwise been financially possible. In death, perhaps Spirit's strongest legacy is the realization that as much as the American air passenger loved to hate it, they also hated to love it. In research for this video, it quickly became clear that mainstream news' portrayals of the causes of Spirit's shutdown were often quite skewed and incomplete. There was an enormous, overwhelming amount of coverage, but it was hard to know what was legitimately useful information versus incomplete facts trying to push a politicized narrative. Right-leaning platforms would attribute the shutdown on the Biden administration's block of the JetBlue merger, whereas left-leaning platforms would de-emphasize discussion of that while focusing on how high fuel prices caused by the Trump administration's war in Iran pushed the ailing carrier over the edge. That's why I found our sponsor, Ground News, to be a crucial tool while writing this video. I've partnered with them since 2023, and this is why. Almost 600 sources cover the Spirit Airlines story, and when I looked on Ground News, I was able to quickly see how each news outlet framed the story. Ground News is an app and website that aggregates coverage of particular news stories, sorts them based on the political alignment of the publisher, then allows you to compare the way narratives differ between the sides of the political spectrum. I know that I tend to consume news sources that align with my political bias, but that even these sources tend to confirm my biases by characterizing politicized stories in a particular way, so I find Ground News helps a lot to figure out what's an objective truth versus a biased narrative. I also love that they display the ownership for each publication, and especially these days, it's becoming more and more clear how that can influence what publications portray as the truth. And then another feature I use is the blind spot feed, which shows you stories that sources on one side of the political spectrum are talking about. I think it's fascinating to see what certain groups of people think is top news while others don't think about at all. And not only is this interesting, but actually really meaningful. A Duke University study on polarization in media found that exposure to news blind spots can moderate political positions and reduce polarization. Ground News is a fully independent, subscriber-funded platform designed for people who want to question the narrative, so if that sounds like you, you can get 40% off unlimited access to a Vantage plan, the same one I use, by scanning the QR code on screen or heading to the link in the description, ground.news/Wendover. Signing up also helps support us at Wendover, so thanks in advance if you do.